Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to dive into a very useful skill for anyone working in the command line, redirections. Redirections allow you to change where the output of a command is going to and where its input is coming from. There are two default output channels and one default input channel. They are identified by file descriptors 0, 1, and 2. File descriptor 0 corresponds to standard input, file descriptor 1 corresponds to standard output, and file descriptor 2 corresponds to standard error output. All this means is that input is read from a channel identified by 0, output is sent to a channel identified by 1, and errors are sent to a channel identified by 2. We can use redirection to change where these channels are going to or coming from. Let's start with a basic example. If I run the ls command, it prints the contents of the current working directory. tmp is the directory I'm using for this series, so I'll change to it using the cd command. Inside the tmp directory, there are two files, log.txt and users.csv. These are the files we used in the previous episode. Running ls writes its output to standard output, which is file descriptor 1, but we can redirect it to a different channel to create a new file in the current working directory. As you can see, the command is no longer written to standard output, but instead, it writes to dirlist.txt. We can check that by printing the contents of dirlist.txt. You may be wondering why dirlist is part of the contents of dirlist.txt. Before, we only had log.txt and users.csv, but now we have three files, dirlist.txt, log.txt, and users.csv. When we redirect the output of a command to a file, if the file doesn't exist, it is created before the command is run. By the time ls runs, dirlist.txt has already been created. We can also write arbitrary text to files using echo, redirecting its output to a file. If you look closely, you'll notice that the contents of dirlist.txt were replaced completely by the output of the echo command. And if we repeat the operation, the contents are cleared out again before writing the new contents. To prevent this, we can use the append redirect to stop the old contents from getting overwritten. Using the redirection operator twice appends the new contents to the file instead of overwriting it. To redirect input, we can use the input redirection operator. This is reading the contents of dirlist.txt and passing them as the input for the grep command. If we try to print the contents of a non-existent file, we'll get an error. It may not be obvious, but the error message is not printed on the same output stream as non-error messages. If we redirect standard output to a new file and then check the contents of the file, we find that the file is empty. Instead, we need to redirect standard error output to the file. As you know, standard error is identified by file descriptor 2. Using 2 along with the redirection operator allows us to send standard error output to error.txt. Printing the contents of error.txt, we can see that, in fact, the error is written to the file. We usually do this to redirect errors to log files. We can also redirect standard error and the standard output at the same time, using ampersand and the output redirection operator. In this example, we've redirected standard error to error.txt. But if we use the same command to print the contents of an existing file, standard output is redirected to error.txt. In the second example, we redirected standard output to error.txt. Using ampersand and the output redirection operator allows us to redirect both channels to the same file, in this case error.txt. If you want to ignore command output, you can redirect it to def null. Redirection allows us to change the streams that commands write to or read from. Output redirection becomes extremely useful when we want to capture the results of commands for later processing, to keep logs, or ignore output messages. On the other hand, input redirection allows us to pass large sets of data to commands, read from regular files. Now that you understand how to redirect input and output, let's take it a step further and talk about Heredocs. A Heredoc lets you pass multi-line strings as input to a command, making it perfect for structured data or formatted data. A Heredoc is defined using the Heredoc operator followed by a delimiter. EOF is a common choice, but you can use any string. Everything between the opening line and the closing delimiter is treated as a standard input. In this example, cat receives the Heredoc as input and writes it to the standard output. Heredocs are also great for creating files with multiple lines of content. Here's how you can create a CSV file. Here, the Heredoc content is passed to cat, which writes it out. We then redirect that output to pets.csv. That's it. You now have a solid grasp of command line redirection, including Heredocs. If you found this helpful, give it a like and subscribe to keep leveling up your command line skills.